Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. We're in week 50 and this week we're going to actually start the quilting process, and this is really where all the magic happens when you're making a quilt, I think. If you're new here, I will put a playlist at the top of the screen so that you can go back and watch any of the videos in this series that you might have missed. We've spent 2023 making a quilt on a garden theme. We've made roughly one block a week, and in the last few videos we've pieced the quilt together, and last time we made our quilt sandwich. So I've got my quilt here, and I had hoped that we would have finished it by New Year's Eve, but we're not quite going to make it, partly because I've taken a couple of weeks off during this year, but also it just does take time, and this quilting process is going to take some time. I will be back in the new year to show you the last couple of stages in the quilt process and show you how to finish it off and add the finishing touches. So I'll just take you around what I've got on my table. I've got my quilt here that is pieced together. You can see the pins in it. We put together a layer of wadding with a backing and our quilt topper in the last video. Now I've also got a quilting hoop. You really don't need this. I thought I'd give it a try this time just to see if it helps with the tension of my quilting. So this is a fairly inexpensive bamboo hoop. It's about 37 centimetres or 14.5 inches in diameter, thereabouts. You can just pick these up off Amazon, and there are loads of different types of quilting hoops. There are floor standing frames, there are plastic clip frames, all sorts of things that you can use to help with the tension. I just happen to have this, which is why I'm using it, and we'll see how it goes. I've got some embroidery scissors, I've got my needles just off camera, and I've got some quilting weight threads here. Now this is a set that I just picked up off Amazon. It's by New Bro Thread or Bro Thread. I did a bit of research and looked at a witch survey of quilting threads, and this one came out as the top performing thread. They're not hugely expensive. I think I got a pack of 24 here for about £23 off Amazon. I will put a link in the description below. The second best performing thread was Gutterman quilting weight thread. So if you don't want to invest in a whole set of these, you can just buy the individual reels. What you're looking for is 100% cotton thread, and you want a fairly robust thread. So if I bring this up close, you can see it's a fairly thick thread and it's pretty robust. I'm giving it a really good pull there and there's no breakage at all. So that's what I'm going to be using to quilt with, and I have picked out some colours that feature in my quilt. Last time I made a quilt, I quilted the whole thing in white, and I thought it might be nice to vary it a bit on this one. So I've got some red in my quilt. The pink from this pack matches my pink almost identically, which is bizarre. I've picked out a yellow as well. The thread is a little bit more acid. It's a slightly colder yellow than the yolky yellow I've used in my quilt, but I don't think it'll matter too much. I've got a white as well, and I've got a green, which is a pretty good match for the striped fabric on the border, but is almost an exact match for the green fabric that I've used as backing for some of my blocks. And I've also got pale blue, and that's what I'm going to start with. So that's pretty much all the kit you'll need, apart from quite a lot of time, because I am choosing to quilt my quilt by hand. I find it a really beautifully therapeutic process, but if you want to go ahead and quilt it on a machine, that's absolutely fine. You should really look at this as a way of making your quilt your own. So I'm going to start off by setting up my hoop, and all I've done there is just loosen the nut at the top of the hoop just to give me a little bit of slack. I'm trying to keep the hoop together. I find it easier to manage like that. and I'm laying the solid hoop, the inner ring, on my table. And what I want to do is find the centre block of my quilt, which is this ribbon stripes block. You basically want to, if you've followed my pattern, you want to count 4 blocks down and 4 blocks in from either the left or right, not including the border, and that will give you your centre block. And I want to make sure I've just got one layer of quilt sitting over the top of that hoop. So I'm trying to untuck everything from underneath. This is going to be quite hard to show you because my working space is quite small to get the filming done, so we're just going to have to you'll just have to bear with me as I fumble around with this quilt. So I'm feeling through the quilt top to see where the ring is, and I've just worked out that my pins, a couple of my pins, are going to be sitting on that ring, and it's going to make it difficult for me to put the ring over the top. So I'm just going to move these pins either side just out a little bit so that they're clear of the ring underneath, and I'm just making sure it's fairly flat and smooth. So now I'm going to take the outer ring and I'm just going to push that down over the top of the inner ring, and you really do need your whole arms in for this because it's so big. So I'm kind of pressing down with the whole of my forearm to get the ring over the inner ring, and once it's over I'm just going to try and tighten up that nut at the top of the ring. I'm going to need a screwdriver because my hands just aren't strong enough to turn the little screw. I'm pulling on the diagonals gently. You can see there's quite a lot of play in this hoop. It's not a massively robust hoop, so I don't want to pull too tight because I might actually just snap the bamboo. So I'm just trying to get a little bit more tension in there without distorting it, and then I'm going to bring in a screwdriver and tighten that nut. I've actually got the wrong screwdriver here. I can't actually remember where my crosshead screwdriver is, but I'm managing, it's fine. So I'm just tightening that up. I don't want it mega tight, but I just want it tight enough that the hoop isn't going to pop off. And we're going to start by quilting this centre square here, the ribbon stripes block. So that's what I'm going to work with, and you want to try and get your quilt to a point where you can get your hand underneath. So what I've done is just rolled up the bottom there. You'll see it better when I roll down the top. I'm just sort of rolling up the excess fabric that's outside of the hoop and just gathering it together. You can do the same with the left and right, and if you want to you could safety pin this together, or you can actually get quilting clips that will hold your rolls in place so that you can work more easily with such a large surface area. But the key is to be able to get one hand underneath your quilt and leave one hand over the top. Now I find it easier to put my dominant hand underneath. I think it's easier to find the needle. My dominant hand seems to just know where to look, whereas my left hand doesn't, but you're going to have to just experiment and find a way of working that suits you. So I've cut a length of thread and threaded it up into a needle. You don't want to get too long a length. My length of thread is actually probably too long here. The danger with having your thread too long is that you will get loads and loads of knots and tangles, so don't be tempted to over lengthen your thread. And I've just popped in a quilter's knot here, and if I bring it up close, it's a sizable knot. I've probably done 4 or 5 wraps there, probably could have done 3, that will do, but you don't want a tiny knot, you don't want it to be too massive because we're going to hide our knots inside the fabric. We're going to start by stitching around the outside of this square. So I've got my needle in place and I just want to slide my needle inside the top layer of fabric, so I don't want to go all the way through to the back. We're just starting off here. So I've slid my needle through that top layer. I'm pulling my thread through, and I just want to pull firmly on that thread so the knot pops through the surface and is hidden inside the quilt. So that's worked there, and if I pull you can see that's really nice and secure and there's no knots on the surface, and we're going to do that every time we make a knot. So what I'm going to do is, keeping my needle quite vertical, I'm going to push right the way through to the back through all of the layers. Now I'm going to go really slowly at first. It does always take me a little while to just work out how best to stitch so that I'm working efficiently. So I do tend to work quite slowly at first, and then I just get into a rhythm, I find my groove, and it all speeds up. So don't be put off by how slowly I do this, because I do speed up, I promise. So all we're going to do is follow that join between the blocks and put in some running stitches. The whole thing's going to be running stitch. It's not going to be the most thrilling bit of sewing you've ever done, but it is hugely therapeutic. So I will spend the next few weeks with this sitting on my knee while I'm watching a movie or a box set in the evenings, and I'll just be quilting away, working methodically until the job's done. So I'm just following that seam, and this process is called stitching in the ditch, and that's when you sew along the joins that are already there. So that's where our quilting goes. You can quilt either side of the ditch, so you could maybe mark a 5mm border either side of the ditch and quilt just inside your blocks if you want to, but I'm going to do something different on the blocks. So I'm stitching in the ditch every time there's a join, and this is the reason why we pressed our seams to the side. So if we'd pressed our seams open when we were piecing our quilt together, all that would be holding these stitches now is the wadding and the stitches joining the blocks together. You wouldn't actually be stitching through any fabric, you'd be stitching in a gap between the fabric, and that's not really enough. So because we pressed our seam up to the green block, I can just about feel it through the surface of the fabric. It means that I'm actually stitching through fabric here, so that blue stripe fabric goes beyond the block into that green block, and so I'm actually stitching through fabric, which makes our quilting stitches much more robust. So there's always a reason for everything we do even though we call this series Winging It because I am mostly making things up as I go along, but there is often quite a lot of thought behind the decisions that we make. So I am just going to stitch along, making sure my stitches are fairly even. I'm going to speed up fairly soon. I decided to just keep my dominant hand underneath, and I started doing a downstroke and an upstroke. Here we go, I've cracked it now. So I'm doing my downstroke, catching the needle underneath and pushing it back up to do my upstroke before I pull the thread through, and that sped me up no end. So always a good plan. So I'm just working my way along to the corner, and it's really important when you're doing this that you have a stitch that goes right into the corner. Now obviously I've got my safety pin there across the corner. I'm not going to take that out yet. I'm going to wait until all of the blocks around that corner are stitched. So I'm going to do my next ring of blocks before I take that pin out. What I will do is take out the centre pin on this block once I've stitched it, so I'm leaving those safety pins in there. But what I've done is either finished or started my edge right in the corner, because if you don't, you're going to end up with a little diagonal stitch on the back of your quilt, and you won't get nice sharp squares on the back with your quilting. So just make sure that you go right into the corner. So I'm going to stitch all the way around that block, and I just thought I'd show you what I'm doing with the rick rack. So I'm following the curves of the rickrack, so rather than just stitching a line across the bottom blue stripe or something like that, I'm actually stitching a wavy line along the edge of the rickrack. I'm tucking my stitches right in to the side of the rickrack so you can barely see them on the front of the quilt, but on the back you'll get a really nice little wavy line, so it'll work quite nicely. And I'm just following that wave of the rickrack. It does take a little bit longer, but what we're trying to do is create an echo of our design on the front on the back of the quilt. So I will show you this a little bit more obviously later on by showing you a finished quilt that I've made in the past and showing you how it works, but we're going to make our design on the front sort of echo on the back just with the quilting stitches, and it just makes it fun. I think I really like it. Now, as I've said, there are lots and lots of ways to quilt. If you wanted to, you could do this all by machine. You could stitch in the ditch between blocks. You could put a regular quilting pattern right across the quilt. You could do diagonals, you could do a free motion, swirly, random swirls design. You can even send your quilt away to companies who will quilt it for you. But I just loved, when I made my last quilt, I just loved this therapeutic, mindful quilting process. It's so straightforward. You don't need to think about stitches. You don't have to think much about tension as long as you're pulling your thread through all the way. You don't have to worry about bits being too slack or too tight. It's just that up, down, running stitch motion, and you just gradually make progress and you work your way out from the centre to the edge, and there's this phenomenal sense of satisfaction when you've finished, and you just have to trust me on that because you'll only know when you've done it. But yeah, you quilt it in whatever way you like. I'm just showing the way that I'm doing it so that if you want to sort of imitate this, you can feel totally free. So I'm just going along the bottom of my rickrack there, and when I get to the corner I will show you how to finish off your thread. So I'm just going to work back up to my starting point, just getting into the corner there. You can see I've gone right into the corner where the rickrack joins the seam, and then I can work my way up that right hand edge back to our starting point. Okay, so I'm almost back to my starting point, and what I want to do is take my needle back through to the back of the fabric. So I've stitched all the way around, and I'm just going to flip the quilt over, and hopefully you can see that line of stitching. So I've got that square, I've got the wavy line of the rickrack at the bottom, and then I've got the edge of the square, and my stitches are maybe half a centimetre long. I've gone all the way around that centre square, and this is what I mean by the echo on the back. So you can see the outline of the quilt blocks on the front. We're going to do a little bit more quilting on this block in a minute, but I just close to the end of my thread. So what I want to do is make a quilter's knot close to the surface. So I've just wrapped my thread around my needle, and I'm just holding those wraps in place while I pull the needle through. It's really hard to do this on camera because I've got to keep it underneath the camera. It's not how I would normally do it, but I've made my quilter's knot, and then I want to slide my needle back into the fabric, bring it out just somewhere random, and pull until the knot that I've made pops into the fabric, so it's gone inside the quilt. Then I want to pull on the end of the thread, push down with my scissors and snip, and the end of the thread just disappears back inside the quilt. So you end up with a quilting design with no beginnings and no ends, no knots on the surface, and you just get that lovely quilted puckery feel and the echo of the design on the back of your quilt. So I'm going to go back to the front, And what we're going to do throughout our quilting process is follow the pattern on each block. So I'm going to stitch along each side of each piece of ribbon, and I'm also going to stitch around each motif on the block. So I'm just going to show you that with this little stamp on my flower garland block. So I'm going to start off my thread in the usual way. I've made a quilter's knot. I'm going to take my needle into the fabric, slide it along a little bit and back out, and then I'm going to pull my thread so that the knot disappears inside the fabric. So give it a good pull and it pops inside, and then you've got no beginning. And I'm going to keep my stitches maybe 2mm away from the edge of the motif, and I'm just going to stitch around the outside. So I'm carrying on with my pale blue thread just because it's what I had in my needle. I just want to show you what I'm doing, but I might actually do this a different colour when I come back to it, I don't know. And again, you need to make sure you've got a stitch that begins or ends right in the corner of your rectangle, otherwise you're going to get a really peculiar shape on the back. So I've stitched around the outside of my stamp there, about 2mm away from the edge of the motif, and then I go to the back, put in my quilter's knot and pull the knot inside. So that's basically it for the quilting process. I think I'm not going to show you the whole quilting process on video. We'll be here for about 3 weeks, but that's all I'm going to be doing. So working on each block, one block at a time, starting at the centre and working my way out. So I will do each ring around the quilt in turn, just similar to the way that we pinned it. We're always going to work centre out. I can remove my safety pins as I go along once a block is completely stitched. One word of warning, don't be tempted to trim back the edges of your quilt. We've left excess wadding for a reason, because as we quilt, things are going to pull in a little bit to the centre, so there'll be a little bit of shrinkage as you quilt, just as all the layers are pulled in together. And if you trim it back too soon, you could end up with a situation where your wadding doesn't reach the edge of your quilt anymore. So even though it's quite cumbersome and there's a lot of fabric here to manage, please don't be tempted to trim anything back at this stage, because you are likely to regret it. So some of our blocks are going to take a lot longer. So our flower garland blocks, we're going to stitch around each flower, and so that's going to take a little bit longer. But then you've got other blocks that are going to be really quick. So like our seed packet, it's just stitching around the rectangle of the seed packet. So one other one that I'll mention is my garden path. I'm not going to stitch between all of the joined paper piecing. I'm just going to go along the edge. And our birds, I'm just going to stitch around the outside of the bird and a circle around the sun, and I might sketch a circle on using a template just to keep me straight on that. And with our border, we're going to stitch along both edges of the border strip, and then I'm going to stitch in between each of the blocks on the patchwork edge as well. So it's just a case of methodically working around your quilt, quilting it in whatever way you want to, and making sure that you've got lots of stitching that permanently joins all 3 layers of your quilt together. And that's the quilting process really in a nutshell. I thought I'd just show you what effect we're aiming at here. So this is my seaside quilt, which is the one that inspired my garden quilt. This I made with a partwork that I started about 10 years ago, and it's out of print now so you can't get it, but you can see all of the quilting stitches. I thought I'd show you this block because we've marked out some of our blocks for quilting. We've marked out some quilting lines, and this is a really good example. So this centre section has got no quilting on it at all. That's just the scenery, but the top and bottom I've stitched a sort of diamond pattern, and it's just following the pencil lines that I drew and just stitching along them, and it gives that lovely quilted design. I've got another block here where I use the spots on the fabric as a guide and put in my diamond pattern there. So that's what the blocks that we've marked out for quilting are going to look like, and then you're going to have other blocks that are far more spacious and don't have very much quilting on. And I had a garland design on this quilt as well, but it was bunting, and so on this I stitched along each zigzag and then along the top string as well. So that's kind of what we're going for, and I'll be back in January to show you how to do the binding, but I think you can just about see the quilting stitches. And if I just show you the back, this is a much better example of what I mean by the echo of the design. So that's the back of the bunting. You can see all of the bunting flags there stitched onto the backing fabric, and here's a bit where I've stitched along rick-rack, and you've got a wavy line on the back there, and here's one where I've done the diamond quilting. So this is the red spot quilting that we did on the front. That's what it looks like on the back. So you get this really sort of quirky echo on the back of your quilt that I think is really nice. So that's it for this week. I don't know how long this is going to take me. I will occasionally do an update over the next couple of weeks and show you my progress and give you some tips as I pick them up along the way. I don't know how long it's going to take me, but I just wanted to say thank you all for coming on this journey with me. I'm not an experienced quilter. I have said in the description of every video that this is a learning curve for me as well, and I just really appreciate all of the comments and the likes and the support, and those of you that have come to shows to say hi and bring your quilt progress along to show me. It genuinely has been the highlight of my year, so I just wanted to thank you all for sticking with me through 2023, through this unusual stitching journey that we've been on, and I hope that you will join me in 2024 for our new project. So I will put out a video in the next couple of days about what we're going to be doing in 2024. The best way to catch that is to make sure that you have clicked the subscribe button and turned on notifications, and that way whenever I upload something you will get a little message to say there's a new video to watch. So our 2024 project is going to be very different to this. It's going to be a year-long project again, but one that is much more easy to dip in and out of. So I hope that you'll join me for that. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you very soon. Bye.